The next time I saw Diego was from very far away. He was leaning out of one of the windows of his house, and half of his face was covered by a bandage, hiding his wounds. That day, his father was preparing for their move. We didn't notice when they left, and they didn't say goodbye to the neighbors. We understood that moving was common back then, and no fuss was made when a family left the neighborhood. But even with the rush, only Carlos, my mother, and I suspected that it had something to do with what happened that night. From then on, Carlos would go out with me whenever possible, especially when I had to return late from catechism or from my friends' houses. My mother even today, especially with what would end up happening later, feels guilty for not giving the whole situation the importance it deserved. There were 2 or 3 days of tranquility until one afternoon when we noticed the absence of Oliver, a stray cat we had adopted months earlier when he was just a baby. Oliver used to disappear in the mornings, but every afternoon, as everyone was arriving home, he would also return without fail. He would come to us with a small bird, a mouse, or some dead insect as a gift. That day, however, it was past 8 o'clock, and Oliver hadn't appeared. My mother and Carlos went out to buy bread for dinner, and while at it, to look for Oliver in the neighboring streets. I stayed alone with Mari Carmen, who was sleeping in the adjacent room. In the distance, on the street, I heard a cat's shriek. It was horrible. Tremendous. It started like those sounds of cats in heat, but soon it turned into something terrifying. Without a doubt, they were screams of pain. I ran out thinking that maybe Oliver had encountered a dog. But when I reached the street, the shriek stopped abruptly, in an instant. For a moment, as if a voice was telling me, I was about to run towards the darkness of the street. I took a few steps when I felt as if I came to my senses. Behind me, the gate door was open. The door to my house was also open, wide open. I ran back feeling that I had to take care of Mari Carmen, who at that moment was the most important thing. As soon as I closed the door, the shrieks began again. I'm sure I wasn't the only one who heard them. I couldn't have been the only one. The sound kept getting closer, and shortly after, when I heard it almost in front of my house, it fell silent. Again. Completely. And then something was heard on the roof. A thud, as if they had dropped a heavy bag and it had bounced towards the center. It was obvious that something had been thrown at the house. That they had thrown something dead at the house. The sound of the gate alerted me, and then that of the voices of my mother and my brother reassured me. They were joking, happy, so I understood that they hadn't heard the cat's shrieks or seen anything. What happened next was my mistake, I know. But I didn't tell them anything at that moment. It was so difficult to have moments like that of tranquility, jokes, or laughter that I preferred to wait. I preferred to keep quiet and wait. And this is perhaps a feeling that only those who have lived in families with as many problems as mine will recognize. While we were having dinner, I heard a movement on the roof. Imperceptible to others, but not to me, who couldn't stop thinking about what had happened just a while ago. The dinner continued, and suddenly something seemed to shake violently up there, and this time everyone noticed. Carlos quickly put on his jacket to go up and check. I rushed out behind him, trying to get there first. He loved Oliver more than anyone, and I felt that I had to spare him a greater impact. If it really was our cat that was now on the roof. I told him I would go up, and that he should hold the wooden ladder we used. It's about to break, and if you fall, I can't catch you, but you can catch me, I said, and he listened to me. When I went up in the distance, I could see a figure. It was Oliver, Or so I thought. However, he was standing, looking towards the street, with his back to me. I spoke to him, and he didn't respond. I whistled. I called him in all the ways he used to obey us, but he didn't budge. "What's wrong with him?" my brother asked. "Is he okay?" "Yes," I said. "Don't worry." But just as I was saying that, Oliver, or the cat that was on our roof, was slowly turning towards me, as if it knew what I was doing, to not alarm my brother, as if that creature could mock me. What I saw then is one of the things that torments me every night when I try to sleep. Even today, every time I close my eyes. When it turned, a half smile on the cat froze my heart. And it was that part of the animal's face seemed to be that of a child. A face very similar to Diego's. Instinctively, I took a step back that made me fall off the ladder. I fell on Carlos, who didn't calculate my weight, and we took a good hit. After that, I only remember that we both cried and that my mom somehow managed to carry both of us and got us into the house. The next thing I remember is when I woke up in the morning with a severe headache, which was no excuse for my mother not to wake me up at 6:30 to get ready for school. All morning I wanted to convince myself that the vision of that cat, or whatever it was, had been just a product of my imagination, of the darkness, and of my concern for Oliver. During recess, Cesar approached me, a 6th grade boy who lived at the end of our street. He came up to me. I thought reflexively that he would try to bother me or hit me. It was a reaction when an older boy approached me, or someone from my group of friends. This time, Cesar, however, approached seriously and with clear intentions of asking me something. "Hey, what happens at night in front of your house?" I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. "Look, my dad always comes home late from work," he said, "and this morning he told us that last night, in front of your house, there were 3 nuns standing on the sidewalk, looking inside, peeking. My mom says Dad came home pale." When I heard what he was telling me, I couldn't answer him and ran away. I found Carlos near his classroom, but before telling him what I had just been told, once again I felt that I couldn't do it. That we would end up worrying my mom. And the last thing she needed was a new concern at that moment. It was a strange feeling. I believed that by hiding it, it was less real. That if I didn't talk about the things that were happening, they would simply stop happening. I wanted to forget about the matter and ask my mom for permission to stay at Raul's house, one of my classmates who had a collection of knights of the Zodiac toys, which made us tolerate him being so boastful a little bit. Oscar, my best friend, and I lost track of time at his house. We played in Raul's room until his mom came up to invite us to dinner, in a tone that made it clear that she was rather inviting us to go home already. We said goodbye, and Oscar ran out, insisting that they were going to ground him for coming home late. Suddenly, I had a reality check. I was just a few blocks from home, but the street looked more sinister than usual. Once again, it seemed that everyone had agreed to enter and close their doors and curtains at 8:00 p.m. I started walking, slowly, as if that made me braver. But a silhouette ran across the street and made me quicken my pace. It was a cat crossing the street, maybe just a simple cat, but the vision from the night before became increasingly present. The only thing I was grateful for was that the full moon slightly illuminated the path home. Suddenly I felt a tightness in my chest and couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone was watching me. I started looking around without stopping walking hurriedly, until on a wall, from among the night, I could see the figure of that cat again, with almost human features and a body too similar to our Oliver's. I looked away, as if I hadn't noticed it, and kept walking. The cat seemed to run parallel to me. The wall it was on ended, and then it jumped from roof to roof, not moving away from me, despite the fact that by then I was running as fast as my body, sore from the fall the day before, allowed me. Suddenly I stopped hearing those little jumps of the cat, from roof to roof, following me. Fatigue forced me to stop almost upon reaching my street and look around, making sure the beast wasn't still watching me from some corner. I felt calm for a moment when I saw it was no longer around. I turned around to walk home, and on the corner, right on the sidewalk where I had to pass, to turn towards my house, half of a black silhouette seemed to peek out to look at me, to wait for me to pass by there. As soon as I saw it, it hid again, and I lost sight of it. I didn't need much imagination to realize that the silhouette was someone, a person dressed or disguised as a nun. At that moment, I was just about 150 meters from my house, and yet I felt that I would never see my mom or my siblings again, and I started to cry, knowing that I couldn't go back to Raul's house, but I also couldn't approach my house without having to cross where that figure was waiting for me. I wished with all my heart that none of this was really happening, and to open my eyes at some point and wake up at home next to my mom and see her preparing dinner. And when I had that image in my head, a little laugh behind me made me stop crying. It was the gypsy boy who was laughing at me, but somehow I didn't feel it as mockery. Before I could say anything to him, he took my hand and started running towards my street. And I don't know how, but I ran with him scared to death. And upon turning onto my street, 3 figures dressed as nuns were waiting for us, crouched on the sidewalk, and when they saw us, they started running as if to block us. The boy threw a stone that hit the face of one of the nuns, who didn't even flinch, but it caught their attention enough for them to pass me by and follow him. "Run, run!" he shouted at me without stopping laughing, and the boy ran down the street with the 3 figures following him very, very closely. I entered my house and endured a terrible scolding from my mother for being late again, while she was scolding me and telling me how upset she was with me. I did nothing but hug her, grateful for that opportunity to be with her again. But at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about the fate of the gypsy boy and hoping, wishing with all my might that he had been faster than those things. When I tell you that in these days, only the strangest characters seem to exist in the neighborhood, I say it completely seriously. There were 2 of them, who might be very easy to remember for those who lived in that place at that time. They were 2 little people who looked like twins, both with thin mustaches, like from the 50s, with their skin permanently moist from sweat and always dressed in suits and hats. There was one more detail that made them a bit macabre. Maybe, to put it some way, at least for the neighborhood children who looked at them carefully. And that is, they both had an extra little foot coming out of their leg, at ankle height. It was barely visible, but it was striking. They always left very early to take public transportation and returned late at night. Some of my friends said they lived in one of the tenements about to fall down from old age, but in reality, no one knew for sure where they lived. I was a child, and they always gave me some fear, but I never thought they would end up being protagonists of the most terrifying night of my life as well. I was barely 8 years old. I don't understand why they let me go out at those hours of the night, although it was evident that my mom didn't know everything that had happened those days. It was also true that if I hadn't needed my backpack so much, I wouldn't have dared to go. especially on a night when my brother Carlos had gone with his dad and wasn't at home with us to accompany me. But well, it was 11 o'clock and I was heading to Oscar's house, my best friend, for my backpack with all the school things. Before turning to his house, there was that old tenement abandoned for years and now inhabited by 3 gypsy families. They called them Bulgarians. But although they spoke a little Spanish, I'm not sure they were originally from Bulgaria. When I passed by there, the figure peeking out the window caught my attention. I could see it clearly backlit by the candlelight from inside. More than fear, I felt curiosity. I felt a strong desire for it to be that boy who I thought had saved my life and soul the night before. I stayed waiting while observing, hoping to find some familiar figure. And eventually, I did, although it wasn't the one I wanted. When they saw me, I suppose, standing in front of them, they suddenly turned off the light, leaving the window in complete darkness. It was then that I noticed it. Up on the roof was the figure of the cat again. That cat with a child's face, which had followed me home the night before. If I had learned anything in those days, it was that the presence of that being announced the proximity of the nuns. So I hurried to walk towards Oscar's house. I tried to do it calmly, but when I heard dogs barking in the distance, I ran again until I reached my friend's house. Behind me, I could hear the barking, getting closer. First, it was blocks away, in the distance, and then very close to me, maybe on the adjacent street. Upon arriving at Oscar's house, I did what I never did, and opened the gate and entered until I knocked on the house door. I don't know if it was because of that detail or because of the time I was going, but Oscar's mom opened the door, looking quite angry. As I was running there, I was thinking about how to make, or what excuse to say, for them to let me stay for a while, until those things went away. But with that reception, I knew I didn't have many possibilities. I asked the lady to let me use the phone, to let my mother know I had arrived. And for a moment she hesitated, but then agreed, asking me not to speak loudly, as almost everyone in the house had already gone to sleep. I approached slowly, observing everything, stalling, listening as the dogs in the houses on the street started barking. Until the dog in the house across the street was doing it. Oscar's mom seemed to ignore it and went to the kitchen. I picked up the phone, fearful. Reflexively, I started to dial my house number, but I knew I wasn't going to make the call. If I dared to tell my mom that something was following me, that I was in danger, she would come for me at that moment, even if Carlos wasn't there, to accompany her. And she would do it with Mary Carmen by her side, or maybe leaving her alone at home. And to be honest, both options terrified me exactly the same. I hung up the phone knowing that I had run out of time to fake that call or to dial, and that I would have to return to the street. But a voice behind me, in the completely dark living room, called me. "They're outside." "Who?" I asked, trying to recognize the figure, now with his back to me, peeking out the window. "Those old women disguised as nuns. They're out there." I realized that the one talking to me was Oscar's brother, a boy whose name I can't remember, unfortunately, but who, despite having left elementary school several years before me, was practically a legend for his talent for playing soccer, for having been in the state selection, and for having completely given up the sport in high school, while in the basic forces of an important team in the country. And he did it was said, to concentrate on school. "Come on, I'll take you," he told me. And before I could answer him, he was already going out to the patio, and I went out behind him, without even saying goodbye to Oscar's mom. I knew I had to take advantage of this opportunity for someone to accompany me. From a corner of the patio, the boy returned with a bicycle with huge rear pegs, big enough for me to stand on them. He told me to get on, and he positioned himself at the garden gate towards the street, half opening it. I already told Erica that these old women are wandering around the neighborhood and they always stand near the church at night. I don't like her staying out so late. Then I realized a rumor that this boy was Erica's boyfriend, my catechist, and I understood why we saw him so much around the church riding his bicycle. I was thinking about that when a pull almost knocked me off the bicycle. In seconds, he had left the house pedaling at full speed, and at the turn of the street, he skidded with the brakes so low that we almost fell. But we continued at full speed, taking advantage of the slope of the street we had joined. The barking, which I felt announced the presence of those things, had been left behind, but he didn't seem to want to slow down. Suddenly, the sight of a car's headlights in front of us made him turn, without even slowing down a bit, to get up onto the sidewalk. I had seen him do extreme things on his bike before, but I was surprised he could do it with me on board. However, the fear of a fall was much more bearable than that of having to encounter those nuns again. Suddenly, two figures crossed at full speed through the narrow sidewalk we were on. And despite the effort to brake, we stumbled into one of them. I managed to let go moments before the collision and barely scraped my knees and hands. Oscar's brother also avoided getting hit, even though his bicycle ended up flying a few meters. The figure we collided with let out a cry of pain, and suddenly the other one came over to lift him up. "They're coming," he said, and lifted him up. And without even worrying about us or taking us into account, they ran away from the place. I hurried to help Oscar's brother up. We grabbed the bicycle and continued at full speed towards my house. Just a few meters ahead, we passed those figures that were still running. I realized they were the two Dwa twins. Oscar's brother shouted some profanity at them that they didn't answer. As we moved away, I stared at them intently. There was an expression of deep fear on their faces, and they ran as fast as their deformed legs allowed them. "Go on, kid," Oscar's brother told me as he dropped me off, and he gave me his fist to bump. I wanted to hug him, but I just bumped his fist and shouted "thank you very much" as I ran into my house. Dozens and dozens of dogs were barking desperately in the distance, each time in a more violent way. And I didn't know what to think, but I finally felt safe. I entered, and my mom scolded me, telling me it was the last time she would let me leave my things in someone else's house. I could barely catch my breath. However, I nodded non-stop, knowing also that she was right. It was the second time that someone had selflessly helped me escape the fate of facing those things. The next morning, my mom was having breakfast with one of her best friends, a very elderly lady, who had always been a kind of adoptive grandmother for us. My mother told her about my fall from the roof, and then they both asked me about the recent scrapes, so I had to explain that I had fallen off a bicycle the night before. "Someone is taking very good care of you," the lady told me with a deep look. "Maybe your daddy from heaven wants you to arrive well, to make your first communion." I didn't know what to answer her, but it made me think. Although I was a child, the luck I had had those days maybe wasn't something normal. On the way to school, we came across a vacant lot, almost in front of a small triangular park. It was full of police and onlookers. My mom didn't like to approach that kind of thing and made me walk without even turning around. At school, Oscar ran up to me. As soon as he saw me, he told me that his brother had been scolded very badly for going out with me at night, and that it took him a long time to return home. He said that his brother had claimed to see the gypsy boy peeking out the window of the tenement when he was returning to his house. And as he told me this, Oscar became very serious, as if he had said something crazy. "What would be strange about that if the gypsies lived there?" I said. "No, not anymore. They all left days ago and abandoned the tenement," Oscar said. Perhaps because of this news, I spent the rest of the day at school like a zombie, thinking more about the gypsy boy and what had happened to me the night before. After classes, I went to the tenement and realized that everything seemed to be true. There were even things thrown outside the little houses, as if they had been left in the middle of the gypsies' flight. It seemed strange to me that I hadn't paid attention to these details the night before, but when I looked through the window, through that same window where I'd seen the figure, I could almost feel someone returning my gaze from inside. The streets were full of police, and we realized why hours later, when we saw the evening news. The body of one of the dwarves had appeared disfigured from so many blows he received until death. And this wasn't said in the news, but among the first neighbors who made the discovery, the macabre detail began to circulate that they had torn off the little foot that grew from his ankle. The other one was never seen again,